Now we deep dive into stories and issues shaping the continent, not just Nigeria. And today we examine a critical topic with far-reaching implications across Africa: the ongoing crisis in the Middle East and its impact on Africa's oil prices. Now, with tensions rising in one of the world's most volatile regions, African nations, many of which are heavily dependent on oil exportations, are already feeling the ripple effects.
So to understand or better understand the ripple effects, the security dynamics and their economic impact, we're joined by a special guest today. It's Confidence McHarry, Senior Security Analyst at SBM Intelligence. He's going to bring us some very expert insight on how this conflict is affecting, oil production and pricing across the continent. But first of all, can I say happy birthday again?
Thank you.
Happy
birthday. It's your birthday. Since the topic has been raised, how old are you? Sorry, I'm sorry.
Just don't, a year older. How about that? Well, let's set the stage, shall we? Can you give us a brief overview of the current situation in the Middle East and just the impact on oil prices globally, specifically for Africa?
All right. So a year ago, we were looking at the prospect of war. People were hoping for a limited war. The people who supported the war, especially Israel, they were hoping for a limited war. But one thing students of international politics will tell you is that a limited war hardly stays limited. So right now, a year later, we're looking at not just war. We are stuck in between war or more war. So people are trying to scramble to get used to one of the two facts which they are much more comfortable with. But what we've seen so far is that given how interconnected the Middle East geography is with continents as their neighbors, the problems are at least still local. The Middle East is bordered by Africa to the south, and it's also bordered to Europe on one particular hand. So while the Europeans are feeling it, the Africans are also feeling it. So usually in the past, let's say if this was happening in 1973, when the Yom Kippur War happened in October, you'd be having African countries, especially people within OPEC, oil producers, being happy that price is going to go up. I mean, coincidentally, when the Yom Kippur War happened in October 1973, Nigeria benefited largely from the oil boom. It was part of these things that set up the chain of infrastructural developments the one administration used. Yes. But if you fast forward 50 years down the line, things have largely changed. So each time there is a problem in the Middle East, Nigeria always feels very nervy, like we are not going to benefit from this. And the reason is due to the fact that we don't produce as much oil as we do, and most of our production is already accounted for. And unlike in the past where we had fuel subsidies that will be able to insulate the average person from the price, we no longer have that. So whenever there is an oil price shock, the next person on the streets is going to feel it. So that's the current situation we're having at the moment.
Now, this is based on the fact that Nigeria at the time could export oil and then also apply that to subsidy, and you and I wouldn't get to feel it. Now I get it.
Right. So African nations like Nigeria, like you said, we, especially Libya, for example, there are major oil exporters. There's also Angola, there's Nigeria. Can you explain how volatile the volatility in the Middle East and how it's influencing their oil revenue and what this means for their economics as well?
All right, so for the Middle East, there are people that are going to benefit from this thing. I think Saudi Arabia, being a leader of the OPEC cartel, stands well to benefit. But where Saudi Arabia's benefits end is in trying to export oil through the Gulf, especially along those routes where you have the Houthi rebels on one hand trying to control the area, and then you have the Persian Gulf where a problem in Iran is going to set off problems in the Persian Gulf, where you expect that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is going to be causing problems for shipping around there. So what some countries who expect this did was they tried to preempt this. So I think, was it in March last year that China called Iran and Saudi Arabia to a room and told them, cut the shit. The two of them, they've been at loggerheads for about a decade. I think one of the things I remember that stood out was in 2015 when a Shia-aligned cleric in Saudi Arabia was beheaded by Saudi Arabia, and Iran didn't like it, so two of them broke off the diplomatic relations. And apart from that, in 2019, Iran backed Houthi rebels in Yemen, fired off missiles into Saudi Arabia, and then caused problems for Saudi Aramco. So China preempted this and then called two of them to the room and said, you guys do not need to be fighting. I need oil. And so they were able to normalize relations. So That is where the problem stops. It doesn't necessarily mean that getting two of them into your room has solved the problem. China is also still wary. But for many of all these other countries, between the Middle East and North Africa, there is one major way by which they would export oil, whether to Europe or the Far East, and that's through the Mediterranean. So you're passing through the Gulf of Aden, you're passing through the Eastern Mediterranean, you're passing through the Red Sea, and all of these places have choke points. I just talked about Iran, how it's going to affect these things. You also talked about the Houthis in Yemen and how they've been disturbing shipping ever since October 7 attacks and so many things. So in whichever way you look at it, it doesn't really look good for the continent, the countries in the continent around where this problem is. But if you look at people who are producing oil far away from this place, let me say Guyana, for instance, where oil was found, and then it led to a problem between Venezuela and the regional economies. This is a good bone. But the ability to get their oil production up to meet standards that are enough for them to export in large quantity is light years away.
Right.
So, but for the remainder of the current period, we're having many other countries that depend on the Middle East and North Africa are always going to, should I say, be nervy when these developments happen.
Wow.
Confidence. Now, let me, for the sake of our viewers, I'm going to need these next questions answered in layman's terms as much as possible, because you've got so many words here. First of all, we're talking about crude now, not refined product. We're talking about crude. And we're noting that it's not just the many factors that's affecting trade, that's affecting prices. And one of the biggest ones which we are noting now is logistics. Moving through certain places that have trade policies and all of that, or maybe even insecurity, like what we're experiencing now in the Middle East. Am I correct?
Yeah, true.
So, in a roundabout way, the instance with Libya and Muammar Gaddafi being thrown out of power, how did that affect Nigerian oil exports or earnings?
Yeah, so there's not a direct link between the crisis in Libya, especially in terms of security perspective with the oil thing. I'll try to take both apart in different ways. So there is a way Libya affected Nigeria, and that is through the arms flow from the Sahel. You do know that if you look at Nigeria's external map, Libya is just 2 border crossings away.
True.
So if you go to Nigeria's northeast, you have Chad, and then once you cross Chad, you get into Libya. So the arms flow, they were coming from the Libyan crisis, were flowing through to Chad, and they were making their way down to Nigeria. So one thing that he did was he created a whole new network of arms producers in the country. So if you check many of the press statements from the Nigerian military, especially in the southeast, around that southeast Cameroon corridor, you have a lot of local arms manufacturers from the northeast, southeast Cameroon corridor.
Manufacturers.
Yes,
in
local
Africa.
manufacturers
And so
in
that
Nigeria.
means that the conflict in the Middle East, to an extent, affects, security levels in Africa.
Yeah, it always does, because there's a shipment of arms, and then there's the other way that it does, in the sense that many of all these jihadist groups that are in the Sahel tend to align with the Palestinian cause. So there is going to be pressure, especially for governments that are seen as too friendly to the West. So governments in the Sahel are in trouble. Or if this was 2 years ago, they would have been in trouble. But with the rise of, should I say, anti-Western revolutionary government in terms of military coup in, say, Niger, Benin, and they've been a little bit insulated, from there. And so you have, for much of what we've seen on the continent since October 7 attacks, you've seen even people, even governments that are quite aligned with the West or with Israel have tended to take the back step. I'm talking about Kenya and the like. So many of these other governments have not really been taking, but it hasn't really stopped the terrorists, So it has formed a little bit of a recruitment tool and more of attacks on. And if you check many Western consulates and embassies in the Sahel, they've upped their security threat and their security level. But to answer that question as to how this affects the oil prices and the oil industry in Nigeria, Libya doesn't really have that outsized effect. I would think that Nigeria's problems are largely self-inflicted.
Well, I'm thinking about it in terms of the demand or the supply. Libya was big on oil. It was also it was exporting oil as well.
They were
now
exporting.
With the unrest, how did that affect Nigerian export at the time? Did it make it? Did it increase it? Did it increase the price per barrel? What effect? What commercial effect did it have on the price of oil for Nigeria? Did we gain or did we lose from that?
So we haven't really gained from an oil boom, especially when it comes to crisis in international markets, since 2014. And that's
since 2014.
Since 2014, we haven't really gained. And that is when, if you cast your mind back to the problems the Jonathan administration was having due to its, as regards its 2015 budgeting, it was that it couldn't really get the oil benchmark to match what is stated locally and what is stated internationally. So you have a whole decade that we haven't really benefited, and the problem has largely remained the same. I was saying to Judith earlier that one of our problems is production. You have crisis in the oil-producing areas where even there is an uneasy piece, it's still holding. It doesn't necessarily mean that fuel theft, or oil theft rather, has stopped. You just simply have government officials simply looking the other way. And despite lip services to improving the conditions, it hasn't really stopped, because if they know if that they go too hard on the oil thieves, it's going to cause a problem. The militancy is going to be back. So the little that we're able to produce, when at the height when we were producing up to 2.13 million barrels in 2014, we are now struggling to produce 1.4, 1.5. So, and most of the things we have been producing, it has already been insured. So as of 2020, India used to be our largest oil imports. Now it no longer is. They've been looking for alternative design. As of last year, people were not even buying our oil. Our oil was stuck on many seas. You understand? So we've been having that problem because, number one, we're not reliable and we don't produce enough. And many of the things we already produce, we use to get loans. So I think some of our oil were tied to Goldman Sachs and so many other things. So they were already hedged. Thank you for that word. So nobody really trusts Nigeria again. I would also give you an example. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the European Union needed places to get alternative energy supplies. They came to Africa. I think Olaf Scholz visited some countries. He skipped Nigeria. We already been talking about the Trans-Saharan pipeline, which is supposed to run from Nigeria through Niger, through Algeria to the Mediterranean. But everybody knows that it's not going to work, because the security infrastructure that you need to allow that kind of a pipeline to run is simply not existing. And then you have an unfriendly regime in the other part. So the other necessary, or the other logical way to export this oil is through the sea, which is going to incur more time, incur more cost, and then that place is also not safe. So we haven't really done our homework in a manner of speaking.
We've been talking exports and we've been putting Nigeria in the center. Let's widen our scope now and talk about the entirety of Africa. Most African countries rely on imports for their domestic needs when it comes to energy, whether it's petrol, whether it's cooking gas. We rely heavily on domestic, on our oil imports. How does those imports influence the price for African consumers, giving the Middle East into play, putting the Middle East into play?
These prices, I wouldn't say a lot of them accounted for it. A lot of these governments, they didn't really account for it. So many of these governments are not really that, they're not really that immune. Ghana is one of such countries. We don't really have refineries on the continent. So if you have logistical issues, let's say for instance, if you remember the Suez Canal crisis, not the one of 1956, I'm talking about the one that happened like about 2 or 3 years ago, we saw inflation go up because that place is a choke point. Close to about 10-15% of the world's goods pass there. So that insularity is just an example of how, sorry, it's not really insularity as a word. That's susceptibility to shock. It's just an example of how many of these countries not being able to prepare for these things are finally are receiving the shocks. And as I was trying to say earlier, not many of these countries have refineries. So many of them gets imported refined, they sell out crude, and then they get refined fuel. So given that kind of scenario, similar to what Nigeria is facing, of course, many of them are going to be facing the same thing. So you have Ghana on one hand, you have Nigeria on one hand, you have many other countries, especially along the Sahel and Sahara belts, facing the same thing. I would think that one other country that should be a little bit immune from this shock should be Gabon, because they have significant refining capacity that will limit a little bit of local demand.
Let's talk about the Israel-Hamas war, right? The conflict. And I'm looking at the chat. I'm just taking a look at it. They're going to pull it up on the screen there. And we see it spike, especially the red line there, spike especially high at an inflation of about 35%. And we see it coming down a bit, but it's still very, very high as of November 2023. Talk to me about that, just that chat, looking at it.
So you have a situation where at the start of the crisis, people were really jittery, and many of the concerns for the oil industry was, should I say, a little bit over the top. But over the past year, I think they've relatively stabilized. Well, I would say that people's demand and consumption have quite gotten used to it. So that alarm hasn't really been that.
So that, you know how it gets a balloon and then it bursts and everyone just there's a normal.
But with the current iteration of the violence, with it threatening to expand into a wider Middle East war involving direct exchange between Iran and Israel, I would think that we might actually be back there where we were at the start of the conflict in the next few weeks, especially if this fear is actually materialized.
Wow. And if that happens, what are we looking at in terms of crude prices, importation of prices, and even just the price for the regular
local man?
Yeah.
You expect it to go up. As I've said earlier, the shock absorbers that we usually have when you have an NPC doing much of the bulk of the heavy lifting is all gone. it's all gone. So you're exposed, directly to the issues. And from a geopolitical standpoint, yes, the economists are going to be looking at how this thing is going to affect them economically. But from a security standpoint, also from a geopolitical standpoint, it doesn't really inspire much hope. And one would actually be hoping, especially if you're in this part of the world, one would actually be hoping that Israel does not follow through on its intents to strike Iran directly, which of course,
wow,
is
confidence. I don't know how confident I am after bringing you on the show here today.
I would think that it's really inevitable. I think many countries in the EU and also in the United States have been preparing for it. I don't think that any person that wins the November election in the US, for instance, is going to actually restrain Israel from striking Iran. It's a procedure. Given that they haven't really stopped their arms shipments to Israel, despite some EU countries promising to do so, you kind of know that it is a scenario they have planned for, just like friendly governments to the West are prepared for a potential Trump return to the White House. So these are scenarios they're planning for. So we cannot sit here, especially in this part of the world, and say, please, Israel, do not strike Iran. It's going to happen. So you just have to get on with the program. Just get on
Confidence.
with the
I want to say thank you very much for that masterclass in the economics of war as it relates to fuel prices in Africa.
And also the proliferation of small arms with this conflicts that we see in the Middle East as well.
The dynamic is crazy. You wouldn't expect that it's related. But thank you very much, birthday boy.
No problem.
for coming over on your birthday on a Sunday morning.
Thank you.